Today we're going to take a look at equations, and when we think about an equation, I want you to think about like a scale where one side of the equation must equal the other side of the equation. In our example here, we have A is equal to B. Now there are some properties around equations. There is the addition property of equations. All it says is if I have some value of A, if A is equal to B, then if I add a value to A, let's call this C, then I add it to the other side, the equation should still be equal. So let's plug in some numbers and see how this works. If the number A is equal to 7, then we know that B must also equal 7. So the equation would state that 7 is equal to 7. Now, if we add an additional value, we call this C. Let's give C a value. We can say C is equal to 3. Then if I add 3 to one side and I add 3 to the other, sure enough, 10 is equal to 10. The property of subtraction states the same idea. If I have a value A that's equal to value B, if I subtract from A, a C value, and I subtract a value of C from B, the equation again should be equal. So we can try it out. 7 minus 3 should be equal to 7 minus 3. Later on, we're going to call this what I do to one side, I do to the other. And in our class, instead of naming out the exact properties, all we're doing is stating that we know if I do one operation to a side of an equation, and I do it to the other side, it should remain the same. So we can check. 7 minus 3 is 4, and sure enough, that does still equal 4. It gets a little bit more complicated as we get into multiplication property. So if I say if I have a value of A, and that's equal to B, then if I multiply by the value of C, and remember the brackets just means multiplication, or we can call these parentheses, that's fine. So if I put parentheses around them, it just means A times C and B times C. So 7 should still equal 7. That's our A and B. Our C, we said, is 3. So I can multiply by 3, and I should get 21 is equal to 21. The division property states that if I have a value A and it's equal to a value B, if I divide by a value of C, they should still remain equal. So we can check. 7, of course, is equal to 7. If I divide by a value of 3, 7/3 is in fact equal to 7/3. So nothing too fancy, nothing new, but let's see how this is practical and used on one-step equations. I have some examples of one-step equations here, and they're called one-steps because it only requires one step of operation for us to solve. And so remember, when we are solving equations, we're always solving for our variable. So always solving for our variable. Okay, so in this case, our variable for number 1 is the value of x, because we don't know what x is. Some of us may have already substituted in a value for x and solved it, but there is a way to do the math, and it goes in these 3 steps. Step number 1 is to set up our equation. Okay, so we just write it down, copy it down. Then we say, what am I solving for? Well, I'm solving for the value of x, but something's happening to my x, and it is being subtracting 4. So we're subtracting 4 from our value of x, so we have to use the inverse operation, is what we talked about in our class. The inverse just means the opposite. So what is the opposite of subtraction? Well, we know the opposite of subtraction in ours will be addition. And same thing, what is the opposite of multiplication? The opposite would be division, and it goes both ways. We can go one way or the other way. So in this case, we would say, well, if I have an x minus 4 and that's equal to 7, I should do the opposite operation, and that would be an adding of 4. So I can add 4 to both sides. Well, x minus 4 plus 4, those two should cancel each other out, and I should be left with x. And again, 7 plus 4, because what I did on this side, I'm doing to this side, I should get my 11. So now I've solved for x. I can check my work by substituting or moving the value back into the equation, right? So x is 11, and I can check, is 11 minus 4 equal to 7? That was the question. And sure enough, 7 is equal to 7, and we know that the value must be 11. All right, so this, instead of saying that this is just an inverse operation, this does go back to what we talked about, and that is how we added our value of c to both sides. So this is actually called the additive or addition property of equality. We just call it what I do to one side, I do to the other. So not to overcomplicate it with just the naming jargon, but we do want to understand what we are doing. A little bit faster now as we get into the other operations. So 2 will be a representation of the subtraction property, 3 will be multiplication, and 4 will be division. And I'll just zoom out a little bit so we can see everything at once here, if it works. There we go. So let's try the next one together. Let's use purple this time. So I have a 3 plus, or sorry, an n plus a 3 value, and it's equal to 5. Well, the inverse or opposite operation is subtraction. So we're actually using the subtraction property. So I'm going to just subtract 3. I'm going to do it a different way this time. I'm just going to subtract 3 at the bottom. And notice how I'm lining up my number with the other number. And the variable is by itself. So the variable just drops straight down, and we were left with n. And a positive 3 minus a 3, well, that kind of cancels out. And 5 minus 3 is going to give us the 2. So very quickly, there's our answer. Okay, so n is equal to 2. And let's go ahead and do a quick check. Is 2 plus 3 in fact equal to 5 is the question. So we're just substituting that back into our variable, and 5 does equal 5. So we're done. Now we're coming across a fraction, and this is a little bit weird, but just I want you to remember, if I have 1 over 3, and there's a video on multiplication of fractions, remember our variable m. M is the same as m over 1, right? So any value divided by 1 is itself. And when we multiply, we just multiply across. So I would actually get m over 3. So m over 3 is the same as 1/3 m. But a way to think about it is just you can rewrite it as such, m over 3. So let's go ahead and look at this equation. If I know it's m over 3, well, we talked about ways that we can describe a fraction, right? I could say what I said, m over 3. I could say m divided by 3. Or I can say m thirds, I guess, right? I like to use the second one because then I remember what operation I'm doing. 1/3 m, or m divided by 3. So what is the inverse operation? Well, let's bring it down here. M divided by 3 is equal to 2. I know that the opposite of division is multiplication, so we're actually using the multiplicative or multiplication property. I need to multiply by a 3, or we can think of 3 over 1, if that helps you to think of it. And I'm multiplying by 3. Well, 3 times m is 3m, and 1 times 3 is, of course, our 3. That's equal to 2 times 3, which is 6. Well, we learned 3 divided by 3. Those cancel out, so I'm just left with m. So my final answer should be m equals 6. Okay, we'll review some of these, and I'll break them down into steps so that they're a little bit easier to remember. Here, finally, we are at the last question where it says 6y is equal to 3. Well, what's happening to our variable? We're always solving for the variable. Well, 6y is another way of saying 6 times y. That's all it is. So when we have a number with a variable, it's called a coefficient, and it's multiplied by a variable y. So what's the opposite of multiplication? Well, of course, it's division. And we learned just a little bit ago that a fraction is the same as division. So let's just make it into a fraction. Let's divide this, erase that, divide this by 6, and divide the other side by 6 as well. Well, 6 divided by 6, that gives us a value of 1, right? And we don't need to write it, but we can say 1y. And so 1y is equal to 3 divided by 6, which we could reduce down to a 1/2. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and erase this so that we don't get too confused with the 1 there. It's just y is equal to 1/2. And I forgot to check this, so let's, oops, I didn't mean to do that. So let's go ahead and check this together really quick. For the top one, for number 3, if I have 1/3 and I multiply that by my value of m, which is 6, does it equal to 2? Well, we learned that 6 is the same as 6 over 1. So 1 times 6 is 6, and 3 times 1 is 3. Is 6 divided by 3 the same as 2? Yes, it is. So checked. Next, I have, for number 4, 6 times y. My y this time is 1/2. Does that equal 3? Well, again, 6 is the same as 6 over 1. Multiply across, so I get 6 divided by 2. Does that equal 3? Sure enough, 3 is equal to 3. Okay, in my next video, we'll go over a couple more one-step equations. We'll take a look at two-step equations and break them down into kind of chunks or at least a few steps.